My uncle said it the way people say things they have already decided are finished. Casually, completely, with the particular confidence of someone who has run the numbers, made the calls, and is now simply informing the remaining variables of the outcome. We were at my grandmother's dining room table, the one she has set for Sunday dinners for 40 years, the one with the burn mark near the far corner from a candle she forgot about in 1987, and my uncle. Curtis had just refilled his glass and leaned back in his chair and said it with a smile. The farmhouse closes in 30 days. Buyers already signed. I figured we'd celebrate tonight since we're all here anyway. He looked at me across the table. You'll get your cut, Clara. 50,000. That's real money for a 19-year-old. He raised his glass. My mother smiled. My aunt nodded. And I reached into the bag beside my chair, pulled out a single manila folder, and set it on the table in front of me without opening it. Before we celebrate, I said, I think you should see something. The smile on my uncle's face stayed in place for approximately 3 more seconds. Then he saw the seal on the folder. County Recorder's Office, filed and certified. And the smile stopped being a smile. Before the story gets darker, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what city you are watching from, because betrayal does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it sits at your kitchen table, calls you family, and waits for you to stop paying attention. And sometimes they forget who your grandparents trusted. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 19 years old. I grew up in Harnett County, North Carolina, the only grandchild of Earl and June Whitmore, who spent 53 years building a life on 48 acres of farmland outside a small town called Dunn, a town where the same families had farmed the same land for 4 generations, and where the word inheritance carried a weight that city people mostly did not understand. My grandparents were not wealthy by any standard that would impress anyone in a downtown office building. They did not have investment portfolios or vacation homes, or the kind of assets that generate their own gravity. What they had was the farmhouse, the land, the equipment shed my grandfather built himself in 1974 with lumber he cut from the back 40, and a combined savings account that represented 53 years of careful, deliberate, patient accumulation. They also had 2 sons. My father, Daniel, who died in a car accident when I was 4 years old and who I know primarily through photographs and the stories my grandmother told me on the porch in the evenings when the light was going gold over the tobacco fields. And my uncle Curtis, who had spent the 30 years since my father's death positioning himself as the family's decision maker, the practical one, the son who stayed close enough to manage things and far enough from the actual work to avoid doing any of it. My grandparents saw both of them clearly. They planned accordingly. I only understood how completely they had planned when I was 17 years old, and my grandmother pressed a business card into my hand during what turned out to be our last real conversation, and told me, in the quiet, direct way she said everything important, not to lose it and not to tell Curtis. I did not lose it. I did not tell Curtis. Curtis Whitmore was 54 years old and had spent his adult life in a comfortable orbit around my grandparents' resources without ever contributing meaningfully to them. He was not a villain in a dramatic sense. He did not twirl a mustache or deliver speeches about money. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more damaging, a man who had convinced himself, through years of careful self-narration, that proximity to his parents' lives constituted a form of investment, and that investment entitled him to returns. He visited the farmhouse on holidays. He brought wine. He fixed things occasionally when asked and made sure the fixing was noticed. He called himself a family man in the way people call themselves things they want others to believe rather than things they have earned. My grandmother told me once, while we were shelling butter beans on the porch, that Curtis had a good heart but a weak character. He loves people, she said, until money gets between them. She said it without bitterness, the way she said most true things, plainly once and then not again. I remembered it the day my grandfather died. I remembered it when Curtis arrived at the funeral and spent 40 minutes of the reception on the phone outside. I remembered it at 19, sitting across from him at the dining room table, watching him raise a glass to celebrate selling a farmhouse that had never belonged to him. The first sign came at my grandfather's funeral when I was 16. I was in the kitchen helping my grandmother arrange food on platters when I heard Curtis's voice from the front porch, low and deliberate, talking to someone I couldn't see. With Dad gone, we can finally have a real conversation about the property. The land alone is worth something. The house is a money pit. We should think about timing. I carried a platter of ham biscuits to the dining room and said nothing. The second sign came 4 months later, when Curtis began appearing at the farmhouse with a casualness that felt rehearsed. Sunday afternoons, usually, sometimes with a clipboard. Once with a man I didn't recognize who walked the fence line while Curtis and my grandmother sat on the porch. My grandmother told me afterward the man was a surveyor. She said Curtis had arranged it without asking her. He means well, she said. Her voice said something different. The third sign was a conversation I was not meant to hear, 6 months before my grandmother's death. I was in the upstairs hallway when Curtis's voice came through the kitchen ceiling, vent with the clarity those old farmhouses produce in the wrong moments. Mom, you're 81 years old. The property is too much. Let me handle the transfer while you're still here to sign things. It'll save everyone trouble later. A pause. My grandmother's voice, even and unmoved. I've already handled it, Curtis. What does that mean? It means it's handled. He did not get an answer that satisfied him. He spent the following year trying different approaches, reasonable ones, financial ones, emotional ones, the ones that dressed urgency in the language of care. My grandmother deflected each of them with the calm, unhurried patience of a woman who had already made every decision that needed making and was simply waiting for the relevant parties to catch up. The fourth sign was the business card she pressed into my hand 3 weeks before she passed. Helen Marsh, estate attorney. Below it, in my grandmother's handwriting, she knows, trust her. I called Helen Marsh the morning after the funeral. She had been expecting my call. She told me everything my grandparents had built, quietly, legally, irrevocably, over the preceding 4 years. And I understood for the first time that my grandmother had not been deflecting Curtis. She had been stalling him, while the shelter was already built. Helen Marsh's office was on the second floor of a building on Main Street in Dunn. Small, organized, the kind of office that smelled like paper and coffee, and took its work seriously without needing to announce it. She sat across from me at a desk covered in folders organized with the particular precision of someone who had spent 30 years ensuring that other people's careful plans survived contact with careless heirs. Your grandparents retained me 4 years ago, she said. They established a revocable living trust, which became irrevocable upon the death of the surviving grantor. That's your grandmother. The farmhouse, the 48 acres, and the savings account are held in the trust. You are the sole beneficiary. She slid a document across the desk. My name, the farmhouse address, the acreage, the account balance. The deed was recorded under the trust at the county recorder's office in 2021. Your uncle's name does not appear on the title in any capacity. He has no legal claim to the property. I stared at the document. Does he know? Helen's expression did not change. Your grandmother specifically asked me not to inform him. She said, and I'm quoting here, Curtis will find out when Clara is ready to tell him. Not before. I sat with that for a long moment. My grandmother, 81 years old, shelling butter beans on a farmhouse porch, had outmaneuvered her own son years in advance with the quiet precision of someone who knew exactly who she was dealing with and planned for it. Without drama and without anger, I drove back to the farmhouse. I sat on the porch in the chair that used to be hers. I stayed until it got dark. Helen and I met 3 more times in the months after my grandmother's death. She walked me through the trust documents with the methodical patience of a teacher who wanted to make sure her student understood not just what the papers said, but why each provision existed and what it protected. The farmhouse deed, recorded under the trust, was clean and unambiguous, No probate required. No contested estate. No window for Curtis to file anything that would create legal confusion around the title because the title had never been in the estate to begin with. Helen also told me something I had not known. 3 weeks before my grandmother died, Curtis had contacted Helen's office directly. He had identified himself as the family's point of contact and asked for information about the estate's assets. Helen had told him professionally and without elaboration that she represented the trust and could not provide information to parties without a documented interest in it. Curtis had told her he was the son. Helen had told him that was not a documented interest. He had not called again. I asked Helen what I should do next. She told me there was nothing urgent required. The title was secure. The trust was settled. My role as beneficiary was legally established and recorded. You don't need to do anything, Clara, she said. Unless someone tries to sell something that doesn't belong to them. In that case, you show them the folder. I bought a manila folder the following day. I kept it in my bag for 4 months. I brought it to the graduation dinner. The dinner was my mother's idea, a celebration for my first year at community college, held at my grandmother's dining room table because my mother said it felt right to gather at the farmhouse. Curtis arrived with wine and the easy confidence of a man who had spent 4 months believing a plan was proceeding on schedule. He had been busy, I learned later from piecing together what Helen told me and what my mother eventually admitted she had no more of than she let on. He had contacted a real estate agency in February. He had arranged for an informal walkthrough of the farmhouse with a buyer, a development company from Raleigh interested in the acreage. He had represented himself as the property's managing heir. He had negotiated a purchase price and signed a letter of intent. He had done all of this before verifying the title. He had assumed, the way people always assume when they have spent years being the one who handles things and have never once been told clearly that handling things and owning things are not the same. So he sat at my grandmother's dining room table, poured wine into my grandmother's glasses, and announced to the assembled family that the farmhouse was closing in 30 days and that I would receive $50,000 for my cooperation. He said it the way my grandmother had warned me people like Curtis say things, as if the deciding had already happened and the only remaining step was informing the people who didn't matter. I let him finish. I let the table settle into the silence that followed his announcement. Then I reached into my bag. I placed the folder on the table. I did not open it. I just placed it there. Curtis looked at it. What is that? The trust documentation, I said. And the recorded deed. He stared at the folder. What trust? The one Grandma and Grandpa established 4 years ago. The one that holds the farmhouse, the land, and the savings account. The one that lists me as sole beneficiary. My mother set down her fork. Curtis's jaw tightened. That's not possible. I'm their son. That doesn't appear anywhere in the title record. I would have known about a trust. I opened the folder. Slid the recorded deed across the table. His name was not on it. Mine was. Curtis stared at the document for a long time. The kind of looking people do when they are searching for an error and cannot find one. Your grandmother was confused at the end, he said finally. She didn't understand what she was signing. She retained Helen Marsh 4 years before she died. The trust was established while she was fully competent, witnessed, notarized, and recorded. Helen has the documentation. My aunt touched Curtis's arm. He pulled it away. I already signed a letter of intent with a buyer. You signed a letter of intent for a property you don't own, I said. That's between you and them. The dining room was completely silent. My grandmother's clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere outside, a mockingbird went through 4 different songs. Curtis sat back in his chair. He looked older suddenly, the way people look when the version of events they have been living inside collapses and the actual version becomes visible. He did not say anything else that evening. The consequences arrived in the measured, sequential way that legal consequences do, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, each one following naturally from the one before. The development company's attorney contacted Helen within 72 hours of the dinner. Curtis had represented himself as the property's managing heir in the letter of intent. The deed on file at the county recorder's office told a different story. The company withdrew from the letter of intent and sent Curtis a formal letter noting the misrepresentation. Curtis retained an attorney to contest the trust. His attorney reviewed the documentation and advised him, according to what Helen told me in a later call, that contesting an irrevocable trust established 4 years before the grantor's death by a mentally competent grantor with full legal representation, proper witnessing, and a clean recorded title would cost significantly more than any realistic claim to the property was worth. Curtis did not contest it. He did not speak to me directly for 6 weeks. When he finally called, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. He did not apologize. He said he thought our grandparents had been unfair. I told him I thought they had been very fair. I told him that fair and equal were not the same thing and that our grandparents had understood the difference for a long time. He hung up. Helen called me the following morning to confirm that no further legal action was pending and that the title was clean and unencumbered. "It's yours, Clara," she said. "No clouds. No complications." I thanked her. I drove to the farmhouse. I sat on the porch. I breathed. The hardest part was not the confrontation. It was the Sunday morning 3 weeks later when I was in the farmhouse kitchen making coffee, and I looked at the dining room table, the one with the burn mark from the candle in 1987, and understood with quiet, sudden completeness that my grandparents had sat at that table and made a deliberate decision to protect me from people they loved, not from strangers, from their own son. They had seen clearly what love and clarity together could see, that Curtis was not malicious exactly, just weak in a specific way that money makes certain people weak, and that weakness pointed in a particular direction, and that direction pointed at me. And they had planned for it, quietly, legally, without drama, without anger. With 53 years of patience and a meeting with a good attorney and a business card left in a drawer they knew I would eventually open, I poured my coffee. I sat at the table where they had sat. I drank it slowly. And I thanked them, in the way you thank people who are gone, which is to keep doing what they prepared you to do. I did not win. That is the first thing I want to say clearly. There is no winning when the people who try to take something from you are people you grew up thinking were safe. There's only keeping a promise. My grandmother sat on a farmhouse porch and told me the cabin, the farmhouse, the land, the table, the 53 years was mine. She said, "Don't let them take it." She did not say it because she thought I was special or because she loved me more than her own children. She said it because I was the one who asked whether the roof needed patching before I asked what the place was worth. She said it because she knew I would show up on Saturday mornings with a broom and a willingness to stay. She said it because that is what she and my grandfather had always believed about the people worth trusting, not the ones who showed up for the value. The ones who showed up for the place. I am still showing up. I intend to keep doing it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave your city in the comments. It means more than you know. I will see you in the next one.